thanks very much for your presentations. They really gave us a lot to think about. Very inspirational, and good to see this real demonstration of putting the theory into practice and the learning that took place. Let's kick off with a question for Maria. Maria, I was wondering whether you've seen, you talked about the importance of children and families, and how that as children come along, families will move away out into the suburbs. Through the work you've done in Vienna, would you say that, have you been able to show that you have stopped that trend or reduced that trend? Are more children and families staying in the centre because of the activities that you've done?
Well, as a matter of fact, at least temporarily, we have managed. This means that for some years in a row, we have had actually a contrary trend, with people returning from outside the city borders towards the city again. But of course, this is something that depends on several factors. So I could not claim that this is happening each and every year. Right now, for example, as a result, I believe also of the COVID crisis, we have young couples leaving the city again.
Okay, yeah, great. And I have a question from Karen Tambayong in Indonesia. Karen was formerly the chair of our Green City Committee. She's wondering how much, is there a percentage of your budget from the city that you allocate for greening initiatives such that as you've presented to us?
Oh, this is some question indeed. This is very, very tough for me to answer. You see, the overall budget of the city of Vienna is at about 14 billion. But let me tell you that it is, I don't know, perhaps at least 50 million per year, because we do greening on several budgets. That is, we have a budget for greening itself. And then we have a budget for, let's say, redesigning streets, just to give you an example. So greening is paid for from several budgets. And as a matter of fact, I would have to correct myself. I would say it's at least 100 million per year, because it depends if you also count maintenance of green spaces in it or not. So yes, Vienna spends quite some parts of its budget for greening.
Yeah, I agree. It was not a nice question, because it does come from many different places and sources. And we have a question on the chat. Someone said, Chloe Fredetti says, I am curious to know what is Vienna's perspective about green infrastructures and phytotechnologies, such as green roofs and walls, or vegetated stormwater management infrastructures. Do you have a particular perspective on these?
Well, what we have done recently is to complete our green spaces concept for the next decade. And it does contain a lot with respect to green roofs. As a matter of fact, green roofs are mandatory in Vienna, or you have to, when it comes, of course, to larger developments, or you have to spend at least part of the roof in order to install, for instance, solar power. So these are two things that are mandatory once again for roofs. But what we have also done is to actually make vertical greening much easier than it was before, which is quite an issue in cities that have listed buildings, pretty much like Vienna, and I guess many other parts of Europe face such issues as well. And what we have also done is to introduce, for instance, financial support for greening backyards, which is also an issue in places with listed buildings, because in the 60s and 70s, many backyards were covered with cement to turn them into car parks. So we're turning them into green backyards again, just to give you a few examples. But what I personally feel that is one of the most interesting developments is that we also have introduced a new piece of legislation that allows to uncover part of the pavements along buildings to allow for vertical greening, which was also not something that could be easily done before. Just a few examples.
Okay, thank you. I'm sure Peter has experience as well of the issue of concreting of parking to make parking out of gardens. But I wonder, Peter, you talked about trying to implement policy and establishing policy based on a factor and a calculation for greening. How effectively are you able to police these policies to ensure that they are implemented not just in the public sphere but by private developments as well?
Okay. First of all, just to say grüß Gott to Maria. My sister-in-law lives in Vienna, so I've been to Vienna lots of times. It's a very fantastic city. So the policing, I guess, it's a combination of trying to develop policies which are not overly prescriptive. So one of the big issues we've tried to be doing in London is trying to make sure that we set policy frameworks which can easily be embraced and adopted by people, rather than appearing to be overly prescriptive or punitive. You've got to find a way in which people can implement policy relatively easily. So the urban greening factor, it's a challenge. It's a policy, it's a challenge to developers and planners and architects to achieve the right outcome. But we can ultimately fall back on planning regulation and potentially refuse planning applications that don't meet that urban greening factor. But that's not really the sort of main intent. The main intent is to encourage a collaborative approach to the greening of the city. Because I think most stakeholders now realise that unless we green our cities, unless we make our cities more livable and reduce the domination of motor traffic, they won't be great places to live, and people will start moving our cities. And as Maria said, I mean, COVID has already begun sort of the reverse of the trend. Some people now want to move out of cities because of a fear that they will be less livable places. We've got to convince people otherwise, because they're still the economic centres. They're still the places where you can find all the other benefits of social living in cities. So now is the time to really demonstrate that green infrastructure, urban greening, is something that benefits all. It's not just an environmental issue, it's an economic issue as well, and a social issue.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And one of the other questions we have in the chat is how you feel London's planning policies differ from those in other cities in Europe or in the world, even in terms of what you are doing. How do you think it's distinctive what you are doing compared to other cities?
London was always lucky that it had an existing network of parks and open spaces, and that was largely a consequence of its historic development, because unlike many other European cities which were built as defensive cities because of hundreds of years of conflict on the European mainland, most British cities grew organically. So that's why lots of UK cities have got lots of parks and green spaces compared to some other European cities. So we've been lucky to have that sort of baseline of good quality green spaces. And then we've stolen ideas from places like Munich and Vienna and other cities. So things like the urban greening factor is an adaptation of good policy that's already been happening in Sweden and Germany and Austria. So we're lucky in that respect of having an existing good baseline of parks and green spaces, being able to adapt policies from other European cities, and also because London's a world city, not finding it too difficult to get developers and architects on board because land values are high. So implementing urban greening is not a significant additional cost to a developer in London. It's quite a marginal cost and has significant benefits in terms of retaining tenants or selling properties. So if you went to other UK cities in the northeast, for example, implementing some of those urban greening policies is a bit more difficult because the viability of schemes is challenged more by implementing greening. But so we're fortunate in London in terms of land value and property value is very high.
Okay, thank you. Well, we have Jennifer here. I think she's had some challenges getting in. You're still on mute. I don't know if you can click on the microphone no, that doesn't work. Okay, so we have Jennifer here, but we can't hear you. But I would like to thank you for your presentation as well, Jennifer, because it's great to see the process of generating the new ideas and inspiration from people in the city through your Women for Climate program. But thank you to each of our speakers, to Maria, to Peter, to Jennifer. You've given us a really inspirational session, and thank you so much for your time today.